Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Welcome tonight to our next in our webinar series. This one is entitled Guelph. It's not enough, how successful communities are fighting climate change. And tonight we have our special guest, Dr. Farbridge, speaking about Canadian and global best practices that are out there. Before we go much further, I'm going to hand the podium over to my colleague Jaden Lasachuk, who is working with us courtesy of Canada Summer Jobs, and she's been a real godsend to have with us. And Jaden hails from a very small town in northern Manitoba, and she's currently working on a master's program at the university simultaneously while she's working with us. And that master's is specifically at looking at the implications of what impact that the climate strikes have had across the country. So she's doing some very interesting research out there. And I'm going to hand the podium over to you, Jaden.
Hey, thank you, Evan. Hi, everyone. We want to remind everyone as we gather today that Guelph was built and is situated on treaty lands that are steeped in rich Indigenous history, cultures, knowledge, and truths, and that this land and the rest of Turtle Island is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples today and since time immemorial. Today, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Anishinaabe peoples whose traditional territory we are meeting on today. It is our responsibility to continue to educate ourselves on the issues being faced by Indigenous peoples and communities across Canada. This week, for example, there have been rising tensions and acts of racial violence against Mi'kmaq fishers in Nova Scotia from the Sabinagane First Nation, and it is key for us to understand how we can help this First Nation, whose goal was to establish a moderate livelihood fishing business. Some actions we can take is to email their elected representatives, as well as to reach out to our own and to research the rich histories of this First Nation. As a community of settler Canadians, we have a duty and a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work, and a responsibility to respect, uplift, and empower Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast who have tended this land and respected it for the air, water, and land for generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaden, and I'm so glad that you included what's going on in Nova Scotia around right now around the lobster fishery. It's a very timely issue, and if people haven't heard, I'm so glad you brought it up so that we can put it on people's radar in the event that they haven't heard about it. It fits very well with one of the items that we're going to be speaking about very shortly. And folks, if you hadn't noticed, our colleague Russia, who has gone off screen right now, she has just activated a poll that we'd appreciate that you would do. It shouldn't be running for much longer. We're just asking you to quickly do that, and we'll issue the results. And then shortly after that, we've just got a few slides to go through so that we can then move on and tell you about some other exciting things that are coming up with Emerge in the weeks to come. I should also highlight the fact that I think all of you are probably aware that this was there was a speech from the throne today, and yes, there were there was an environmental component to it, at least on the surface of it. I mean, it's kind of difficult to get a really good handle on it because, needless to say, the proof is going to be in the pudding, or the devil in the details. So we probably won't talk about it just because it's kind of difficult to get a handle on that. Karen and I, we exchanged some emails about it earlier, and there probably isn't much sense of talking about it unless someone has something really pressing out there or some insider information. I think it's still a little early to do that. So on that note, I just want to say that we'll end the poll, and it's not a surprise, the results. The question was, do you believe that individual action will be enough to achieve our climate goals? 3% of you said that indeed that was sufficient. It's not a surprise that the majority of you said that we need considerable coordination to achieve our climate goals. And I guess I can stop and share the results. There they are. Not a surprise, and it fits very well with what we're going to be speaking about tonight. But before we get into that, just a couple of things that I'd like to talk to you about. If I can get my screen to work. Oops, there we go. And I'm just going to shut down the polling. I want to let you know about the next event that we're hosting next week, and that event is being hosted jointly with 9 other local environmental groups, where we're bringing in the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, Jack Gibbons from the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. Jack Gibbons and Angela Bischoff were the leading forces behind the coal phase-out, the largest single climate change action in North American history. It was profound what they did, and they've been at it for well over 20 years. Now what they're going after is the natural gas, on the natural gas side of things, and unfortunately, Ontario is proposing huge increases in the amount of burning of natural gas, and of course that will make it extremely difficult for Ontario and specifically Guelph, all of us, to meet our climate goals. So don't miss that one. That's next Wednesday, September 30th, and we're hosting it in conjunction with 9 other environmental organizations in Guelph. And then 2 weeks from now, an exciting event about environmental racism. Subtext is called There's Something in the Water, and the name comes from a book by Dr. Ingrid Waldron of Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. A very interesting story here about a First Nation in the Pictou area, Pictou Landing First Nation, that for 50 years had pulp and paper pollution dumped into a lake on their reserve, and really just got pushed around. It's unfortunately one of the, I hate to even use the term, best examples of environmental racism in the country. Ingrid wrote the book, There's Something in the Water, and it caught the attention of a very famous actor, Ellen Page, who happens to be originally from Nova Scotia. And after Ellen read the book, she began tweeting about it and supporting Ingrid's work. And ultimately, what they did was they jointly did a documentary that wound up leading at TIFF last year. And if you do have Netflix, it's available on Netflix. And if you're going to be at the event next week, you may want to do that as homework. Something a little more challenging to watch if you have availability of Netflix. And the documentary is indeed called There's Something in the Water. And then immediately, shortly after that, that's 4 weeks from tonight, but not on a Wednesday, on a Thursday, is an event called Clearing the Air, where we're looking at the health impacts of electric vehicles, but we'll also be releasing, this is pretty exciting, we did a survey in conjunction with the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute at the University of Guelph this summer. And we were trying to gauge people in Guelph, their interpretation and their attitudes towards electric vehicles. And we specifically tried to get opinions from people that didn't like EVs. We specifically went out there attempting to do that. We haven't seen the results yet. We had close to 200 responses, and the researchers at the university would have been happy with 70. So they were quite ecstatic with the numbers that we've gotten, and hopefully we've got some really good enough numbers that we've got some interesting stuff to share with you, and that'll be in about a week's time. Briefly, what I would just like to share with you, and many of you have seen this before, is that tell you briefly what Emerge Guelph does. We fight climate change, and how we fight it is through a narrative of pushing towards a goal of 100% renewable energy by 2050, which is very different from net zero carbon, from the standpoint that there are ways of achieving net zero carbon without being 100% renewably powered out there. The city has 2 specific targets. One is a city-wide target, the one on the bottom, and that would be net zero carbon by 2050. And then the corporation of the city of Guelph, we were successful in getting the city to adopt 100% renewable energy target to be achieved by 2050. But I got to tell you, we went into that asking for 2050, knowing that it's probably way too long off, and we think it's way too long off. It needs to be significantly shorter than that, and net zero isn't good enough from our perspective as well. That we believe that we need to be a lot more vigilant on those 2 targets. So from our perspective, we believe that we need to get to that 100% renewable renewable energy Guelph much sooner. So on that note, I want to introduce our guest speaker tonight, who I could be a lot more formal with Karen, but I want to say I think all of you know her as a former mayor of Guelph, even if you may not have been in Guelph at the time. She was the first female mayor of Guelph and had 2 different terms. But before that, she had a long history of being a city councilor in Guelph, doing some very progressive things. She was instrumental on the issue of waste management and water conservation within the city of Guelph. And then during her tenure as mayor, she was, it was profound, the early work that she did on community energy planning that brought the community way ahead of the game compared to everyone else. Prior to that work, she was also a coordinator at OPERG up on campus and has been an academic in the past as well. More recently, and of course she has a PhD in zoology, but Karen, I learned an interesting story today, and I promised I wouldn't embarrass you too much, so hopefully this doesn't embarrass you too much. I understand that a couple of weeks ago that you were swimming with a water snake in a lake on a canoe trip. I believe it was in the Massasauga Provincial Park that I just thought was the cutest thing on earth. And here it is, zoologist Dr. Karen Farbridge, former mayor, swimming with snakes. I just love it. Hope I didn't embarrass you too much, Karen. I'm going to stop sharing and provide you the opportunity to hopefully not embarrass me any more than that. There you go, Sharon. There you go, Sharon. There you go, sharing. I'll share the screen with you now.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you everyone who has come into this webinar. I really appreciate it. I'm going to just take a second here to share my screen. There we go. I'll just get confirmation that you can see my screen okay. Anybody? Thumbs up. Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to start, just so a heads up, I'm going to do my presentation in 2 parts. So we'll have a break in the middle, around 20 minutes. And so that'll be a nice break for everybody to ask any questions and sort of break up the presentation part. And then I'll do the second part and there'll be an opportunity for questions after that as well. I did want to start by answering the question that Emerge has posed with this and last week's webinar that Rob Kerr presented. And the question is Guelph doing enough to fight climate change? And the answer is no, but we're not alone in Canada. And so I think it's something that we need to work on together. Evan has asked me to speak to some best practices, but before I delve into some specific examples and stories, it's important, I think, to step back and to recognize that action by local government in collaboration with their communities is a global best practice itself. So the whole conversation is a global best practice. This is where the measurable change is being led around the world. And community energy planning, which is the practice that supports that, is also a best practice and has evolved considerably over the last decade since Guelph approved its first plan. So I'm going to get the slides to move. Sorry, my slide seems to be stuck.
Karen, I found that I had to touch it with my cursor and then use the down button. There we go.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Good. So I find it a relief to say this. After many decades of being in the trenches, we do finally have a global alignment on climate change. We agree fighting climate change is important. The definition of that is likely to have a profound effect on success, survival, and well-being. That sounds about right. And it's urgent. It requires immediate action. However, what we don't have is anything close to a consensus on the scale of the response that's required. This graph shows you the staggering growth in global energy consumption over the last 50 years or so, and it's still growing. By 2040, despite the growth of renewable energy, fossil fuels are expected to comprise 3/4 of global primary energy. So my intent in sharing that information is not to dismay you with this outlook or suggest that change is not possible, but to emphasize that this is a big ship to turn. And our use of energy is deeply tied to our economy and our modern way of life. My concern is, in the work that I do and what I see in the media and across the country, is that we have lots of well-intentioned action, but with insufficient impact. We see communities developed laundry lists of potential actions, but no strategy to implement them. Where we see strategies in communities, there's insufficient resources and a lack of commitment to the ongoing collaboration that's required to achieve their goals. And we see a lack of strategic integration in decision-making, even in communities with robust community energy plans. My colleagues and I continue to see requests for proposals for major facilities, planning initiatives, infrastructure being issued with no reference to their energy strategy. Every new planning initiative, secondary plan, neighborhood plan, must be based on the principles of net zero, or you're going to lock in energy consumption and emissions profiles for decades to come. So unfortunately, despite the incredible growth of community energy planning across the country, too often what we see, it's business as usual in the communities. You may have heard reference to needing a wartime response to fighting climate change. And I do think it's an apt analogy. And I think we also have some recent pandemic examples to refer to. I would give you the federal government CERB program, the mobilization to manufacture ventilators domestically, and the global effort to find a vaccine as being examples of that considerable effort to move something, to make a change. I wanted to spend a little bit of time about the history of energy transitions, because that history has something to teach us about best practice as we consider how to accelerate the modern energy transition to decarbonize our energy system. Our first energy sources were local. European settlers in Upper Canada relied on a pre-industrial energy system. They burned wood to stay warm and to cook their food. They harnessed the muscle power of animals to grow food. And during the 1800s, we saw the growth of water mills across Ontario in particular, to harness the movement of water to grind grain and to saw logs. And Guelph is also an example of that. The transition to coal and steam, the first energy transition we experienced, ushered in the first industrial revolution. And by the end of the 1800s, US coal and local steam engines powered most of Ontario's industrial growth, including that in our own community. However, as the century turned, energy security started to become a concern for local politicians and Ontario's boards of trade. Rising coal prices and frequent shortages were threatening local prosperity and growth and development of the communities. Municipal governments across Ontario began to turn their attention to a new technology, electricity. And within a few years, most electricity systems in Ontario were owned by municipal governments. As local demand grew, 14 Ontario towns formed the Power for the People movement and were instrumental in the formation of the Hydroelectric Power Commission of Ontario. Sir Adam Beck, the Commission's first chairman, was an early champion as the Mayor of London, Ontario. and abundant, cheap Niagara hydroelectric power arrived in Ontario homes for the first time in 1910. The second energy transition from steam power to centralized electricity and ultimately oil and gas ushered in the second industrial revolution. And it has built our current energy system that has been with us now for about a century. The lesson 100 years later is that the second energy transition was accelerated by local leadership and collaboration between local governments, business, and the provincial government to establish the institutions that were needed to invest in new energy infrastructure and grow the market for electricity. None of those things existed at the time. They were built. And we need the same kind of collaboration and entrepreneurialism today to build the next energy system. I'm going to refer to these 4 themes later in my talk, and that's leadership, collaboration, investment in institutions and infrastructure, and market transformation. While our current energy system has become very highly centralized and largely based on non-renewable energy sources, the modern energy transition is taking energy sources local again. While climate change is a key factor in the modern energy transition, there are several others. New cost-effective technologies for generating and distributing energy locally, the coming together of communication and energy technologies, inefficiencies that have grown in our existing system, which brings costs, added costs, and growing concerns about energy security, including consumer issues of affordability, accessibility, and reliability. And so I think all of this is good news in the fight against climate change because they're all pushing in the same direction. But it does mean that communities will need to engage in understanding their energy system in ways that they haven't had to for over 100 years. So how do we step up to the challenge? Well, first we need to understand how energy flows through our communities. We need to know our own local energy systems. And second, we need to identify where in that energy system we can make the interventions that will reduce energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. Third, we need to integrate those interventions into policy in every decision we make. That is the wartime response. We simply don't have time to miss opportunities anymore. So I'm going to move through a series of slides. I'm taking a little bit of risk because they're quite complicated, but I would ask you to sort of sit back, not get caught up in the details, and hear the narrative that goes along with it. And I'm sure everyone will be able to follow along. So, and I want to do this to ground our conversation. And so I want to describe how energy flows through a typical Canadian community. So from left to right on this slide, we have source energy. So this is produced outside of our community and is primarily comprised of gasoline, diesel, electricity, and natural gas. Energy arrives in our community at the gas station, gas meter, or hydrometer. Then we put that energy to use, and a variety of uses, from transportation to heating our homes to lighting our buildings. As energy flows from source to its final use, some of that energy is useful, and you can see that in the middle of on the right. But some of it is unused or wasted. And as consumers, we pay for all of that. We pay for the unused, the wasted, and the useful. So when we do community energy planning, we look at all of that, even if that waste is outside of our community, because that's money that we spend, and most of that money leaves our community. And so there's opportunities to repatriate those dollars back into our communities and help with the energy transition itself. And then, of course, along the way, there are greenhouse gas emissions released as a result of our energy use. So that's the basic model. this is what we see in this diagram when my colleagues Peter Garforth and Gerd Fleischhammer apply a community's energy data to the energy flow model that I just described. So in this case, this is the energy flow through a typical Ontario city, and Guelph would look quite similar to this. As in the previous slide, energy flows from left to right, from source energy to the pumps and meters to our end users. What's different in this slide, though, is that the width of the lines in the diagrams represent gigajoules of energy. The wider the line, the more gigajoules that flow through that pathway. And as you can see on the far right, less than half of the energy that we pay for is actually useful energy. The rest is unused or wasted, primarily as heat. And so when I talk about inefficiency of the existing system as it's grown over the century, this is what we would be referring to, the inefficiency that we don't get to use as a useful energy. So this is when the diagram gets a little bit more complicated, but it really isn't. The diagram that you see here is based on the previous slide. So don't get caught up in the details. We're still seeing energy flow through the community from left to right through those major stages that I noted. What I've added on the left is the relative contribution of source energy to greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that transportation and space heating, supplied primarily by fossil fuels, contributes 96% of emissions. Although electricity generation contributes the most to waste energy. So that's an important part of the story. So this is the current energy system for a city in Southern Ontario. And one of the goals of community energy planning is to identify where we can make interventions in this system to reduce the amount of energy consumed, whether that's useful, unused, or wasted, as well as reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy dollars that leave the community. That's what we're aiming for, and those are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. These are the local interventions that we talk about the most. I've added them as the green circles. And you would be very familiar with them if you spent any time with Emerge. They have been educating you about them. It's increasing the efficiency of our homes and buildings, increasing industrial efficiency, increasing the efficiency of our transportation system. And this can mean, obviously, increasing transit or cycling or walking. Increasing electric vehicles, something that Emerge has been very strong in supporting. Choosing more efficient vehicles, reducing the trip that people must take in their day. So a number of things there that you would be quite familiar with as potential actions that we can take and intervene in this energy system to achieve those outcomes. These ones focus on end use efficiency. Very important, but not sufficient in the fight against climate change. The ones that I've added on this one look to, and they're in the solid green circles, look to increase the system of the efficiency of the system as a whole. So as the previous ones looked at end use efficiency, this is saying we want to increase the efficiency of the entire energy system that we have. And so these interventions include introducing 2 new energy sources into the urban area. One is local electricity generation, and the other one is local thermal energy generation and distribution to increase the supply of renewable energy and to increase the reuse of waste energy. The good news here is that there are many interventions that we can make. The challenging news is that we need them all. They need to work together in concert. So there are no silver bullets. We need an integrated and full and robust response to it. They will all require individuals to take actions, to retrofit their homes, choose to hook up their buildings to a district heating network, use transit, or generate their own electricity as examples. So what will be required to enable these actions over the next 20 years? With good data, community energy planning shows us how much we can achieve with each intervention, given what we know about global best practice, existing technologies, and current regulations. Where we're falling short is having the courage to make the necessary interventions and to do them at the right scale. And on this slide where you see the red hands, here's where local governments have an essential role to play. As you can see, it's significant. As they did 100 years ago, we need local governments to actively accelerate the modern energy transition in their own communities, and they can do this in many ways. They have the moral authority to bring stakeholders together to promote partnerships. They can facilitate the development of new institutions to deliver new programs and lead investment in new infrastructure. They can ensure that their policies, planning decisions, and infrastructure investments are fully aligned with their energy and climate goals. And they can work with business and industry to ensure that our communities remain competitive. And they can lead by example and promote energy literacy and climate change action. There's things that the municipality can do as a corporation and lead by example, but it's really important for us to keep in mind that the corporate activities of a municipal government, certainly what we see in Ontario, is only about 2 to 3% of the emissions, the total emissions from a community. So very little. So where the big impacts are is with the planning decisions and infrastructure decisions. And those decisions, unless you're focused on making them, focused on them from a climate change lens, can wipe out any gains the corporation makes because you're leading to larger emissions from the community as a whole. So Evan, that is where I was proposing that we pause and take any questions at this point. And I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can see everybody. Where are we?
Great, thanks, thanks, Karen. I've already got a question loaded here so that people can add some additional questions. I'm going to start with the last thing that you referred to. You talked about planning decisions. I love the way you show that there is no one silver bullet, but I have to admit that from a personal perspective, the planning decision one, it really gives me heartburn. Where's the heavy lifting that we have to do there to ensure that it's embedded in all of that planning stuff? Like that is it's so profound. And as you really aptly point out, that those decisions can just nullify or eradicate any of the changes that we make in the other areas.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about it in the second half, but I can give you an example, and it's very current because the community energy plan for Brampton went to council this morning and was approved, along with some other things that I'll get to. And so one of the best practices we're seeing there is energy mapping. And so understanding your energy, how much energy is being used geographically. Because what you can do there then is identify where are your opportunities to build net zero communities from scratch, and where are your opportunities where you're seeing increased density, and so where are your opportunities for district energy, and so if you're going out with any planning initiative in any of those areas, you need to make sure that the principles with which you go forward are to work towards achieving net zero, or to make sure that whatever development happens in an area that can accommodate district energy, that you have that lens, that you're preparing for that, and you're not missing those opportunities. And so what I'm describing there is once you've got your community energy plan, you need to align it through all of the planning and planning tools that that a municipality has, all the way down into operational policies in terms of engineering, etc. Your capital budget needs to be flagged. So if you've got a capital project that's in one of these areas, then they know that they need to take a look at the energy lens. We need that level of strategic alignment in order not to miss these opportunities and not to bake in for several decades energy consumption patterns and emissions profiles. Very much more difficult to retrofit a community, as we know, harder to retrofit an older home than it is to build a home well in the first place. The same concept applies at a community level.
Thanks. It's very helpful. The piece about the planning thing, I think that concerns me the most is that for anybody but policy wonks, it's dreadfully boring. And to get the public excited about those pieces is always problematic. So how would you get people excited about pushing towards those pieces?
Well,
the uninitiated. I'm not talking policy wonks here.
Yeah. Well, you know, the piece I forgot to mention with the Brampton story, one of the motions that went forward to council was immediately to start the integration into their official plan and secondary plan policies. Mm-hmm. And I would say that we do have good policy wonks and we have great policy people. What they need is the space to do their best work, right? And so that initiative and drive to see that alignment through their organization came from the planners within Brampton. And so I think we need to hear these voices. And they need to be given the political space to do their best work for our communities. And they need to be given the resources to do it as well. And there was a supplementary motion that happened today as well to provide the resources to make sure that this could happen in their community. So you know, I use this example as these are best practices live in motion and very current today.
Got it. So thank you. You're so diplomatic, but I think what I heard there is that we need to put political pressure on the appropriate people to give the bureaucrats the small p political and bureaucratic clout that they need to integrate it into everything that they're doing.
Yeah.
But you don't need to say that. I can say that. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the questions here. And Lloyd Longfield, so happy to have you with us here today. Lloyd brings, of course, our member of parliament, and he just mentioned that the clean fuel standard and new building codes coming from the federal government could impact the items on waste. And wondering whether you've done any analysis on, he's thinking natural gas power generation. Boy, Lloyd, that gives me gas in a big way of increasing the amount of natural gas that we're using, but I get where you're going with that, and also talking about cogen. I'm going to quickly run through these, Karen. I'll let you choose the ones. There's another question about Metrolinx here. It's about the electrification plan. This is getting very down in the weeds, and it's specific with where the transformer station would be in Margaret Green Park. I don't think we should take this one because it's very issue specific to that spot. I mean, from our perspective, we want to see the electrification of Metrolinx. The location of that, as I said, I think it's outside the scope of what we're talking about. And great to see Dr. Kirby Calvert here as well from the U of G, who says thumbs up on energy mapping, really critical, and it's a very visual way of seeing this. In terms of planning tools to implement, Whitby Green Standard and St. John Green zoning are two national leading tools from relatively similar sized cities. Karen, I'll leave those with you for a couple of comments, and if we've got a bit more time after that, I can read a couple of more of these. How's that?
Okay, so I've got the comments up here now, and so I can sort of run through them. And so, yeah, no, absolutely, Lloyd. Some of these things that are coming down will be absolutely helpful. You know, in Ontario, we enjoy one of the strongest building codes for energy, so that's very positive in terms of new builds. The challenge is the existing homes. And I believe it's around 70% of homes and buildings we have today are going to be with us in 20 or 30 years. So it is a sector that we need to address. While Evan, you weren't, you didn't want to, it gave you gas to talk about natural gas. We don't, community energy planning is source neutral with respect to energy. What we're interested in is reducing energy and reducing greenhouse gases and reducing costs. And what we will see is that natural gas cogeneration can help us do that. It's part of the transition. And what you see, what you're seeing more in more sophisticated and more advanced systems in other parts of the world is now that they've built the distribution network using natural gas, they're now able to start looking at how can they increase more renewables in those systems. But you need that distribution system to be able to do that. And in the short term, at this stage, with the technology where it is, natural gas to do that cogeneration, as long as you're capturing the heat and using that heat as well as producing the electricity, we can reduce energy consumption and we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And those are the outcomes we keep our eye on. How does the Metrolinx electrification plant, I mean, obviously electrification with some caveats about how that electricity is going to be generated in the future is a transition pathway. There's a bigger issue here about engagement and how the community is or is not being engaged. And so I think I think that's the bigger issue here. If you were well engaged, you would know the answer to those questions, right? Kirby, thumbs up to the energy mapping. As someone who does a lot of energy mapping, that makes sense to me. And providing just some examples of nation-leading tools of similar-sized cities that have been led at the local level. So why is energy waste from electricity? It's primarily at the point of generation. So when you produce electricity with natural gas or nuclear power, there's an enormous amount of heat that's created, and that heat goes off into the atmosphere. There is some lost in transmission and in distribution, but the lion's share is from the generation. So if you can bring that generation into your local community and capture that heat, that's how you can reduce that waste and use the energy much more efficiently. So that's there. Absolutely, there is progress to renewables, and their cost is coming down. They're becoming more viable, but I showed you that first graph at the beginning of my presentation, the scale of what we're trying to do here. And with the International Energy Association, with the best current understanding of what our capacity is, even though we're going to see a significant increase in renewables, we're also going to see a significant increase in energy consumption. And a large part of it is still going to be fossil fuel based. So that's why we need to continue the transformation. Why is it so political? You're trying to change an existing system. And it's not much more complicated than people don't like change. And so that's why initiatives like, for instance, Our Energy Guelph, and I'm going to talk about some of the practices we're seeing in other communities. It's why the whole practice of community energy planning is about convening people and having that conversation so that you can start to facilitate the change. And yes, retrofits in the throne speech, but I'll speak to that a little bit in the future about the challenge there. In terms of methane and sources of methane, obviously something to be addressed. But you know, there's an enormous amount that we can achieve in terms of numbers, in terms of addressing it at the local level in our energy system. So
great.
Yeah. So
Great, Karen. I'm just thinking maybe we should continue on. Karen's got more to present. We purposely wanted to split this up rather than having one big block of slides. And I bet you we could keep you going all night with questions. So we'll turn it back over to Karen's screen there.
Yeah, and I hope that can you see my screen?
Yep.
Checking. Okay, good. And I hope I answered your questions. And if not, take another kick at it after the next set of slides. Okay, you said click on it and then do it. Yes, that works great. So for the remainder of my presentation, I'm just going to share a few stories. There are so many to share as individual stories, but a few stories that highlight how we see leadership and collaboration leading to investments in the institutions and infrastructure we need to transform markets and accelerate the transition to a more local, efficient, and renewable energy future. So it would be a mistake to think that the modern energy transition is new. It's not. It's at least 50 years old. And I think this I thought that it was fairly new. And as I have been better educated by my colleagues, I learned that it's been around for quite some time. The oil crises of the 1970s revealed how vulnerable world economies were to fluctuations in global oil supply. And so many governments took steps to buffer their national economies from future supply shocks, including Canada, which invested heavily in Alberta and Saskatchewan oil sand development. In contrast, and out of necessity, the countries with little or no domestic oil and gas pursued local and renewable energy sources to secure their energy needs. Now, almost half a century later, these countries are leaders in the transition to a decarbonized global energy system and are exporting their energy technologies and expertise around the world. And so we have much to learn from them. And one key lesson is the role of local governments and the importance of engaging the public in growing more energy conscious and resilient communities. So we need to create a movement around this. And so a simple best practice is to look to the experience of these countries and regions and understand how they've been able to transition from fossil fuels to more renewable sources of energy. And I find Iceland is an interesting example because you might think that it's because it's known for its volcanoes and its thermal energy that it has always used it, and that hasn't been the case. Up until the early 1970s, the largest share of Iceland's energy consumption was derived from imported fossil fuels, and so they were hit hard by the global oil crisis. Today, Iceland's economy, ranging from the provision of heat and electricity for homes to meeting the needs of very energy-intensive industries, is almost exclusively powered by renewable energy from hydroelectric and geothermal sources. And recently, they have become one of the leading electric vehicle markets in the world. And so faced with oil shortages and high prices, interestingly, it was farmers that began to tap into the geothermal energy to sustain their business and to remain competitive. This ties back nicely, I think, to the economic lens that Rob introduced in his webinar last week about the important economic piece of this conversation. Even the country's early hydro projects were developed by farmers. Municipalities gradually engaged and built on the farmers' success, and over time, investment in infrastructure and the institutions to support it grew. The collaboration between municipalities, government, and the public to explore and exploit local and green energy resources, in their case, was driven by energy costs and the need for energy security 50 years ago or more. Serendipitously, this has delivered significant reductions in emissions. Public engagement throughout this process was so important to building trust to be able to make that change. Someone asked, why is it so hard to make change? Well, part of it is building the trust to be able to have the conversation about making change. Now, each country and region and community will have a different story. Local renewable energy sources are just that, they're local. And the opportunities and the conditions differ from community to community. However, the journey has many similarities. Local leadership, collaboration, investment in institutions and infrastructure, and market transformation. So just in case you're thinking, well, Iceland is a unique example, and it is quite unique. As it turns out, Canada has significant potential for geothermal energy. And this is a picture of Canada's first geothermal power plant under construction in Saskatchewan. And it's going to power about 5,000 homes. So this slide is a nod to my friend Bob Lazaro, who has joined this webinar. Bob is a former Virginia mayor and an early leader in community energy planning in his state, and I had the great opportunity to meet him. He is now the executive director of the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, where he continues to advance community energy planning, a place where coal is king. And they have two projects to accelerate the adoption of local solar energy in Northern Virginia. A solar map to demonstrate to homeowners and business owners how much solar energy can be generated by their rooftops. And you can see the image of that on the right. And a one-stop shop to facilitate financing and installation. So it has all the markers of success, the four themes that I have on the slide, on the image. This is a recent project in London, England, the BUNHILL Energy Centre. And I've included it because I just think it's, it's very creative, and it just shows what you can find in your community in terms of waste heat, to take example of. And so this energy centre uses the heat generated in the London Underground to heat almost 1,400 homes, one school, and 2 recreational facilities. At the same time, it reduces greenhouse gases and also lowers heating bills for customers. So it's a much more efficient and cost-effective heating source for homeowners in the area. So again, looking at these 4 themes, the Mayor of London convened the partnership between the local council and Transport for London. London City Hall funded the feasibility studies and secured EU funding for the project. Numerous public and private sector partners were involved. Lloyd, you will recognize some of the names in the list as some of the companies that we met with when we were attracting companies to Guelph in the energy sector. In this case, the market for heat was already primed by investment in a district heating network in 2012. The Energy Centre was able to connect into this existing network, and in doing so was able to enable its expansion. So with this, I'm taking a risk and hoping that this is going to work. This is a short video. There's no sound, so don't worry if you don't hear anything. It's from Aberdeen in Scotland, to show that in a relatively short span of time, how a community can grow a district heating network. And what's interesting is, like Canada, the UK had not had a great deal of experience with district heating, but that is quickly changing as they move to decarbonize the heating of their homes and buildings as part of their response to climate change. So I'm going to pull up the link. There it goes. Let's scroll down. And I'm going to bear with me a second. There we go. I'm going to play this and do it at full screen. There we go. And so what you're seeing here is first the energy centers that they built at different nodes throughout the community. You notice that they started in 2004, so not that long ago in terms of energy system change. And next, what you're starting to see is how they start to build out their district energy systems, where the pipes are being laid, the major buildings or centers that are key anchors to these systems. You see them start to build them out in smaller areas, and then you start over time to see them start to get connected. And it grows, and it grows. And my colleagues, you know, the early, when we were doing the community energy plan many years ago, the comment was from one of my colleagues was, once you start to build a system, other people want to connect. And this is a great example, visual example of that. So I'm going to come back to our PowerPoint. And hopefully that's come back to that. And so there's an old image, not the best image, unfortunately, but this is the Guelph District Energy Strategy, the Vision for 2040, and a remarkably similar image and still relevant strategy for district energy in Guelph that was developed just a couple of years after Aberdeen began to execute on their strategy. I thought that this might take an enormous amount of time, but Aberdeen has certainly shown how quickly you can build a system when you have a clear strategy and a commitment to execute on that strategy. I mentioned in answering some of the questions, and Kirby Calvert raised this around energy mapping and gave some thumbs up for that. A best practice is energy mapping, so that you can identify the opportunities for net zero, where opportunities for net zero developments exist. This is your undeveloped land where you can get it right from the start. And also look at where you're seeing increasing density so that you can support district energy and heating systems. Then what you do is you align all policy, planning, and investment decisions to accelerate the energy transition in these energy planning districts. If you don't, and proceed with business as usual, which is what we're seeing so much of it across the country, you are locking in that energy consumption patterns and the emission profile for decades, and just making your challenge that much more difficult, because it's much harder to retrofit than it is to design it right from the beginning. And I mentioned Brampton and that they approved their community energy plan this morning. And Brampton is doing this well, the alignment. They are aligning their urban transition with their energy transition. So they did an extensive program to community design, a community engagement program around their future, a visioning process. And the community energy plan is essentially a chapter in that plan. And as I mentioned, one of the resolutions that was approved by council was to immediately start to integrate that into their planning policy. So they see how the energy transition can help leverage their urban transition, and the urban transition can leverage their energy transition at the same time. So if you have an opportunity to take a look at their work, it's really great work. Just a quick word on home energy retrofits, because it got mentioned a couple of times, and there's funding that's come, new funding. There's been a fair bit of funding on home energy retrofits. We are seeing municipal leadership as communities across Canada are preparing for and or have applied for new funding from the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. We're beginning to see municipal commitments to provide property assessed financing, sometimes referred to as PACE, sometimes referred to as LICs, all the same thing, in order to be able to help owners and support homeowners make these, do these retrofits. And a nod to Our Energy Guelph, who is working to keep this conversation alive in Guelph. The challenge, though, here is that at the moment, many of these initiatives and programs across the country are really pinning their hopes on the existing market. And the problem is that that market needs to change. So the challenge is going to be achieving the scale we need to have an impact and to transform the market. Currently, retrofits cost too much. A deep retrofit is approximately $40,000 for an average home. So there's a good reason why consumers have not been retrofitting their homes. That's out of reach for many. Guelph had developed a business case for a purpose-built institution to deliver standardized retrofits at high volumes a number of years ago. Fortunately, several municipalities have picked up this ball, and some organizations as well. And some of these municipalities have applied or are in the process of applying for funding to execute on their business case. So the investment, which is not colored yet, we've got the leadership is there, the collaboration is emerging. The investment and the market transformation is coming, and have strong hopes that we're going to see this particular issue start to move and get some of the change that we need. And so I'm going to close at this point, and then can open it up to questions again. Some questions about alignment, and if you didn't hear it throughout the presentation, I think I said the word, and if I didn't, I don't know how I managed not to. But how much alignment, how important alignment is. I think it's interesting that we are seeing lawsuits in the US against industry who have contributed to rising greenhouse gas emissions. And in the UK, some governments are being taken to court for infrastructure projects that are not aligned with their climate goals. And the citizens that are taking them to court are winning. So I think these are giving us a clue or a sign that the demand for government, community, and industry accountability is just simply growing, and not being aligned is going to become an increasingly larger risk for government and business and any organization. New institutions like Our Energy Guelph are emerging to support communities meet their energy and climate goals. I noted that today that Brampton approved its community energy plan. They also approved the formation of the Center for Community Energy Transformation. So if that doesn't signal an intent to make transformational change in a community and their energy system, I don't know what does. Oakville is proceeding to incorporate an implementation management office. Very similar principles to these other two organizations, again, to support the implementation of their community energy strategy. These organizations are really important vehicles for leadership and collaboration. They convene people, they build trust between different stakeholders. Their success will depend on consistent support from all stakeholders, especially their local governments, and the alignment of local efforts to build a new energy future that is local, renewable, and efficient. I see these institutions, in addition to providing that opportunity for leadership and collaboration and ensuring the alignment that makes sure that investment in institutions and infrastructure is not only happening, but is aligned and consistent with the goals of the community energy plan. But they'll also help to keep us all accountable to achieving the outcomes that we're pitching for. And on some of those earlier energy flow diagrams, it is quite simply to reduce our energy consumption, whether we use it or it's unused or wasted, that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time, we repatriate energy dollars back into our community. The level of strategic coordination and alignment that I just described, that is our wartime effort against climate change. And so with that, I will thank you, and I will thank Evan and Emerge for consistently seeking alignment in our community and helping to support the energy transition through their activities, and also working to keep us all accountable to achieving our targets and goals. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we can go back to answer any more questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Karen. That was truly enlightening. And some of the questions that are popping up are from people that I haven't done a shout out yet. You did mention Bob Lazaro, but the next question, or the first question up, is John Copeland. For those of you that don't know John, well, he's currently retired, but I think he's working harder than he ever did. John has always been at the leading edge of low energy buildings, both residential and commercial, in the country. You can see his question there, Karen. It's what primary sources are you seeing power the heating and district energy systems? Are you seeing any district cooling system? If so, are cooling loops separate or the same loop? Karen, if John doesn't mind, I'd add on, if you want to comment on Enwave out of Toronto as well, whether you think, whether that fits within this question as well.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I focused on heating. It's heating, just to simplify the conversation, there are opportunities for heating and cooling. And Enwave has brought up, is not just about cooling. Enwave has brought and has developed a number of district heating systems as well. So it depends on the location and the applications, et cetera, where they're viable, but absolutely it can be cooling as well. There's an incredible conversation in the chat group, so I'm trying to desperately to find where the questions begin. So bear with. So Evan, maybe if you can point to another one.
Certainly, I see Bob Lazaro there as well. Virginia, no longer king of coal. The state legislature passed and governor signed new legislation that requires 50% electricity generation from renewables by 2035. That's pretty aggressive for a place like Virginia. Congratulations, Bob, and 100% by 2050. That's phenomenal statewide. Wow, coal isn't king anymore. And they just started off 2 offshore wind turbines in the Atlantic, which Ontario can't seem to get going, and making great progress. Peter Garforth, another one we meant to do a shout out to, and for those of you that don't know Peter, he's a colleague of Karen's. He's a leading expert in the field of community energy planning. I know I'm not doing him justice, but he too is joining us from the States. And he's agreeing with Morgan that mentioned that we need to do more training, Karen, with young people in the trades.
Yes.
Lloyd's a booster for Bob, I see.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about the training and trades. If we want to scale up to the level that we need to in terms of retrofits of existing homes, we will need to engage with our colleges and high schools probably as well, to make sure that we're on track to get the skilled people that we need. So Lloyd will appreciate this. There's a lot of job creation opportunities, which I know that is why the federal government has targeted funding in this area, because it can produce a lot of jobs. I just wanted to comment, Bob Lazaro from the US often sends us stories of what's going on in his neck of the woods, and it's good to hear, because as I've said to him, often the news we get out of the US is quite demoralizing, but there are people on the ground, as usual, at the local level, who are doing things a little differently and making some progress for sure.
There's a question, and I honestly think you've answered this one, Karen, but I'm going to pose it again. It's from John and Kathy Prescott. Given the energy mapping and other analyses, what are the top 5 most impactful steps that can be taken at the local level to defeat climate change?
Sure. I think, so first off, I think you know, I'll go back, and I know it's process related, but you need to understand your energy system, because every community is different, and you need to know what you can, what the interventions are that you can make, and at what level, and so what comes out to that analysis. But what we consistently see in a Southern Ontario context is you need to address the housing sector, and so the retrofit of existing homes, that's one of the pieces. You need to address the decarbonization of heating, and so that is looking at district heating in areas that you have the density to support that, and building that at the get-go with new development. And then the transportation sector is I would say the 3. So I'm not going to give you 5, I'm going to give you 3. Those are the 3 key areas. I guess maybe I would say, maybe I will give you a 4th that kind of underlies all of those, particularly underlies building new communities at net zero, underlies the transportation piece, and underlies the thermal energy piece is community planning. So how we plan and grow and develop our community, the policies we have in place will either enable those changes, or they will completely be barriers to those changes. So that would be a 4th, is getting the enabling policy framework in place that those things can happen.
Wow, lots to digest here, Karen. And I see there's 2 more messages that I haven't seen. That the coal mining in Virginia is for coal, that the coal is specifically for steel and not for electricity. Karen, with the pandemic pushing folks out of urban centers into the suburbs, what is the thought on impact on transportation and ultimately GHG generation?
Yeah, that's a concern and something that I think we need to tackle. I think it speaks to more about how do we make our urban centers more livable, and because there's not enough room in the suburbs or in the rural areas to take all the people that might want to move. So I think it's a question about how do we make urban centers more livable so that people aren't feeling that that's a that's the response to the pandemic. We're certainly seeing a little bit of it. And certainly there are people who are examining that trend. You know, I guess we absolutely need to be supporting more active transportation and transit to make the entire transportation system more efficient, as in addition to electrification, which is a pathway as well. So that's obviously going to be quite challenged if we continue to see this transition moving that way, right? So, yeah.
And on that transportation piece, I think you're going to be interested in seeing the report when we release it next month. One of the pieces that's very disturbing that Guelph is replicating the rest of the country, that continually 2/3 of all new vehicle sales in Guelph and the rest of the country, they're in lockstep. 2/3 of them are large trucks, SUVs, and vans, and they're all gas guzzlers to boot. And these things probably use 3 to 4 times more energy than we need to use, without even talking about EVs at that point.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
we're also fighting marketing that has been out there for so long on the consumption of this stuff, that people somehow feel that it's necessary if they've got to have these large vehicles. But I'm going off on a rant. There is one other question here that I thought, Karen, is there still hope for district energy in Guelph?
Yeah, it's science and physics and the laws of thermodynamics. You know, if you take that as your objective starting point, then the answer is yes.
Great. On that note, Karen, I can't thank you enough. This has been absolutely enlightening. You've been a wonderful presenter on top of that, and kept the attention for a long time. There is one more person that I do want to do, actually 2 more people I need to do a shout out to. One is Councillor Leanne Caron. Hello there, Councillor Caron. Glad to see you could join us. And one of our board members, Ian Finley, that also many of you may know that he's a former city councillor as well. And Rasha has just activated the final end poll that will go on for a few more minutes. But on that note, Karen, thank you once again. And folks, next week we have the gas plant issue. So we'd love to see you join us for that as well. And Karen, you can join us too, and you can see why I have gas on that one so much, and love to get into that conversation more with you over a beer or a coffee at some point too. Thanks everyone, and good night.
Thank you, everyone.